This case attempts to place the Vietnam War within the broader context of the Cold War, and more specifically, within the context of the long struggle that was waged by various different means between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Third World for power and influence. So I'm going to begin with a couple of remarks about different fronts in the Cold War with the help of this first of a series of maps which is going to illustrate what we are looking at today. I'll be explaining the legend in just a moment. Most of it isn't on the map yet. I would argue that there were really three fronts in the Cold War, and I'm going to discuss them in the order in which they became significant, roughly. And the first front, I would suggest, was here in Europe and here in Asia. That is where the Soviet and American armies actually met at the end of the Second World War, and including the territory that they had occupied during the Second World War, and which they then turned into their core alliance. That was the first front. As it happens, it is the one that gets the least attention in these 2 weeks we're spending on the Cold War, but I'm sure it will come up. The second front, you could argue, began to develop in earnest in 1949 when the Soviets exploded a nuclear bomb, and that was the strategic nuclear front, on which we both spent enormous amounts of money and eventually deployed about 10,000 warheads. But fortunately for us all, that one always remained simply a matter of war by algebra. You will do some serious analysis and thinking about that front next week. And lastly, there was this enormous front in the Third World that occupied so many of the headlines of the nation's newspapers from the 50s through the 80s, and which reached its climax, at least from the American point of view, in the war in Vietnam. So there was a struggle, sometimes involving war, in the Third World. And what kind of a war was it? Well, as always, I like to return to Clausewitz. And clearly, going back to this slide, it was the second type, not the first. That is, we were not going to defeat decisively the Soviet Union in the Third World. It is interesting that both sides, I think, made a credible case throughout the Cold War that they would treat an attack on the first front, that is, on the territory they had occupied in the Second World War, like an attack on their homeland, and thus that would lead to an all-out war. And thus, that front, too, remained quiet, despite some very, very tense moments in Berlin, and one limited war in Korea. But in the Third World, there was not going to be a decisive victory, but there were endless opportunities, as we will see, for this kind of grabbing territory to hold for presumed strategic advantage and waiting for the peace negotiations, which came only, as it turned out, after communism had collapsed. Now, let me say a few words about why the Third World was such a battleground from a historical point of view. Well, first of all, its political status was up for grabs, much of it, because of decolonization. Much of this territory that we'll be talking about had been part of European empires, and almost all the European empires ceased to exist in the 20 years or so after the Second World War. Secondly, for various reasons, Marxism and Marxist-Leninism had a kind of intuitive appeal to a number of people in the Third World. Lenin, as you know very well from last week, had, after all, defined imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, and he counted on revolts of subject peoples to help bring capitalism down. In addition, many of these territories were poor. Many of them had been exploited by European colonial powers. So there was a natural constituency for Marxism-Leninism, even though that certainly didn't extend to the entire populations of these areas by any means. And lastly, as you learned in the past week, Marxism-Leninism is an extremely powerful organizational tool for seizing power in a chaotic situation, brought about by a change of regime, civil war, major war, or what have you. And the China case was only the first of a series in which such events gave communists an opportunity. On the other side, meanwhile, the United States, in the wake of the Second World War, was equally convinced that our version of democracy and capitalism was the wave of the future and the model which the rest of the world should try to follow. And we felt every bit as much as the Soviets that we were pointing the way to the future, and you will find that in the rhetoric of any Cold War president at one time or another. And indeed, by 1960, there was clearly a perception that there was a worldwide struggle going on between two ideologies, two ways of life, and frequently it was suggested that the future of the world was going to depend on what happened in the Third World. And this leads me to the analogy which also hangs over this case in many ways. The analogy with our first case of Athens and Sparta. They too were competing for power and influence in practically their whole known world and in many different city-states. And there too, in each city-state, almost each city-state, as you recall, almost every one, there was a democratic party which tended to ally with Athens and an aristocratic party that tended to ally with Sparta, in the same way that in so many new nations in the Cold War, you could find pro-communist and pro-American elements contending for power and calling on their patrons for help. This kind of situation is extremely unstable because domestic conflicts have regional and even global implications, and they are so treated as the Vietnam War was. And thus, events can acquire a significance all out of proportion to their actual size. Thus, bringing it to the Cold War context and from the American perspective, one could always argue, and many did, that any time there was a leftist regime in Iran, say, or a revolution in Indochina, or a conflict in the Middle East, the US and the Soviets were bound to become involved, and more often than not, they did. And the question is, why? Well, again, we can go back to the Greeks and to the classic statement of this problem by the Athenians in the debate in Sparta, arguing, first of all, that it was perfectly natural for a power like them to acquire an empire, and that they were compelled to defend it by fear, honor, and interest. And fear, honor, and interest come up a lot in modern contexts in this course, and they're going to come up today in this lecture. They provide an almost automatic justification for intervening almost anywhere that there is a conflict. But the whole point of strategy and policy started, may I remind you, by Admiral Stansfield Turner in the immediate wake of the Vietnam War, is that those kinds of reflexes aren't enough, that any intervention has to be carefully thought out, that the policy objectives have to be weighed against the costs, that one has to make a net assessment and decide whether appropriate strategies are available. And there were American policymakers throughout this process that understood this. And one is one of the greatest of all American strategists, General Marshall, who made this statement testifying against large-scale military aid for nationalist China in 1948. You can find a full version in the Truman Administration in China Reader, which you got last week, although we didn't assign this particular passage. Marshall is saying, in effect, we can't intervene anywhere. We have to pick the places and the methods which are most advantageous to us, and we can't afford to feel that, in effect, we have to win them all. And what I'm going to be looking at from now on, over 6 decades, is the extent to which various American administrations, 5 decades, did or did not follow Marshall's strictures and made intelligent decisions. Lastly, to help navigate our way through this, I've made this list of a menu of strategies, both offensive and defensive, which the United States used at one time or another in the Third World. Let me run through it quickly. Defensive strategies. In other words, how do we hold on to territory that we regard as within our orbit? Well, we can simply assist them in state building or counterinsurgency without intervening. we could do what I call preventive regime change. In other words, the government there is friendly to us, but it isn't doing very well, and we're afraid it's going to follow the communists, so we'll get a new one. Or we could, as we did in Vietnam, resort to full-scale war. We also had offensive strategies designed to bring unfriendly territory into our camp. And those included military coups, usually carried out by the CIA. Sometimes it was simply a matter of diplomatic breakthrough. A few well-chosen words in a state visit can turn an enemy into a friend. Sometimes it was support for an insurgency against an unfriendly power. Full-scale war was a rarely used option in offensive strategies, but it was there. And lastly, there was the option of political and economic isolation. So basically, as I go from the Truman through the Reagan administrations, we're looking at the mix of these strategies which each one used. So let us begin with the Truman administration. And here we have our first map showing what is going on. And I'll take this opportunity to talk about the legend. The dark red represents the Soviet bloc itself. The dark blue represents what we call the free world, that is, the nations with a close relationship to the United States. Now, already in 1950, we have a third color, this orange, which is Yugoslavia at that point, representing a communist nation which has broken away from the Soviet orbit. And we have other kinds of regimes as well. You can barely see Guatemala there, which is pink, indicating a leftist regime, democratically elected in that case, not communist, but probably some sort of Marxist and not very friendly to American business. Later, we will see a lot of US clients, again, not formal allies like NATO. In light blue, we will see Soviet clients in purple, again, non-communist but friendly. And lastly, we have this for armed conflict. Gray means neutral. By the end of this lecture, you may also feel that gray means lucky enough to have been left out of all this for the whole 50 years. Okay. Now, the Truman administration was most focused on the first front I mentioned, and particularly in Europe, and then of necessity on Korea. And that's where it was putting its money, its interest, and its effort. But it had some decisions to make in the third world. One was the decision not to intervene in the civil war in China, which had led to a communist victory, as you know. Meanwhile, there was war going on in Indochina, as you will read about, between the Viet Minh under Ho and the French. In 1950, and actually before the Korean War, we decided, for a mix of reasons, as you will see, to assist the French financially in fighting Ho. The British were fighting an insurgency in Malaya, but for the most part, the Truman administration wasn't focused on the third world. However, the decision not to intervene in China, the communist victory, and then the Korean War was a political disaster for the Truman administration, as you already have learned, whether you think it was a good decision or not. This raised an enormous Republican hue and cry over the loss of China, as we'll see in a minute, and it certainly contributed something to the unpopularity of Truman and the Democratic Party by 1952. And thus, the Eisenhower administration came in with a different focus, a different perspective, and much more of an interest in the third world. Now, one of the dynamics driving this whole process during the Cold War was the dynamic of American politics. The Second World War had given us a feeling of responsibility for the whole world. The Republicans were now exploiting this. Here is then Senator Richard Nixon, the vice presidential candidate, explaining that the Truman administration has lost 100 million people a year to communism since 1946. The vast majority of those people, of course, were Chinese, and that therefore, obviously, it was a failure. Indeed, Nixon and Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, no, not Eisenhower, I beg your pardon, I don't think he did, but campaigned in 1952 on the idea that containment was a sterile and inadequate policy, and it was necessary to go beyond containment to roll back. And 2 years, and the year after he was elected, and with respect to Indochina, we'll get to that in a moment, sorry. Eisenhower coined the famous metaphor, which was going to play such a role in the subsequent history of all this, the domino theory. The idea that if Indochina fell, this is referring again to the war against the French, that other dominoes would fall and that it would be impossible to keep them up. Now, I put the link on the slide, which of course you'll be able to see after the lecture. And it's worthwhile to go to the link because he elaborated on this at length then and elaborated on each of his 3 points, and it is very interesting. But there was, under Eisenhower, at the same time, a reluctance to undertake serious large-scale military adventures. Eisenhower did, as you know, reach the armistice in Korea. And in 1954, when the issue of intervention to help the French came up, he rejected it. The American people simply were not about to get into another major conflict in Asia 1 year after the end of the Korean War. And indeed, that's another dynamic that holds that affects this whole process. Once we have gone through one of these major interventions, there is at least a 10 or 15-year window in which it's very unlikely that there's going to be another one again. And we appear to be beginning one of those windows again right now. Okay. Now, let's look at the situation in 1953, where there were a number of new problems popping up around the world to deal with. Again, the war here is continuing in Indochina, in Malaya, and there's also an insurgency in part of the Philippines. There's this leftist regime in Guatemala, and there is a somewhat leftist government in Iran, which is giving, in particular, British Petroleum a good deal of trouble, and alarming the US because it might be playing footsie a little bit with the small Iranian Communist Party, but it certainly wasn't a communist regime itself. But the Eisenhower administration decided to face all this with some new offensive strategies in the Third World. The first offensive strategy was the strategy of isolation and non-recognition, which the Eisenhower administration applied not only to China, which they refused to recognize as a legitimate government, Communist China, but also, after 1954, to North Vietnam. They would not give diplomatic recognition to Ho Chi Minh. We would not sign the Geneva Accords that gave him some legitimacy, although we promised to agree with him. Dulles seemed to take the position that if we expressed our moral disapproval in this way, in the long run, it would have a political effect. But the Eisenhower administration developed a new weapon, or implemented a new weapon, CIA covert action, to bring down unfriendly governments and also to foment civil wars. The leftist regime in Iran was brought down by a British-American coup, really, involving street demonstrations and alliance with Iranian military officers in 1953. In 1954, the leftist regime in Guatemala was replaced by military rule in the same way, helped by a very small bombing raid mounted in a neighboring country. It didn't take much to topple that regime. So those two dominoes had gone onto our side. That was not all. Jumping ahead to 1958, we see that in Indonesia, where there's a leftist regime under President Sukarno, the CIA has started a civil war, which didn't go very far, in Sumatra to try to get Sumatra to break away. And in addition, they started a guerrilla action in Tibet after the Chinese took over in Tibet. We don't know very much about that one, but it went on for a while. There were other things. Okay. Now, meanwhile, as a result of the crisis in the Middle East, Egypt and Syria had become Soviet clients, as they were to remain for some time, and that certainly was a setback for us. Okay, if we go 2 years later to 1960, an election year, we see more trouble. The Congo, newly independent, is in the midst of a civil war in which one of the contenders for power, Patrice Lumumba, is certainly a Marxist. And above all, Cuba has been seized by Fidel Castro, who clearly now is a communist. In addition, there is a civil war in Laos, where a pro-American regime had been maneuvered out of power in 1960, and clearly the insurgency is heating up in South Vietnam. So things aren't all going our way by any means. Now, for China, I had to invent at this point a new color scheme because the situation is rather complicated. China, by 1960, was clearly, to any calm, informed observer, not an ally of the Soviet Union anymore. They were already waging a bitter propaganda campaign, and in fact, Mao was accusing Khrushchev of having gone soft and of appeasing the West. However, the United States policymakers were not capable of absorbing that, and we were still treating China as an enemy and as indeed some sort of part of the Soviet bloc, even though the evidence was mounting that that was not true. Now, what was the Eisenhower administration doing? Okay, the Eisenhower administration was reacting to these changes with covert action as well, and this was the great era, it turned out, of CIA assassination plots. One was mounted against Lumumba, the leftist leader in the Congo. He was actually assassinated in early January 1961, although it seems that he was not assassinated by the people the CIA had hired to do it, but by other people. In 1959 and 60, in 1960, they also mounted a major effort to assassinate Fidel Castro, and to do so, the CIA enlisted several leaders of American organized crime who had had major interests in casinos in Havana that they had now lost. At the same time, they were preparing the Bay of Pigs invasion, training about 1,500 Cuban exiles who were at some point going to land in Cuba to try to overthrow Cuba. And they had also started a preventive counterinsurgency project. The Dominican Republic had been ruled for a couple of decades by Rafael Trujillo, a very brutal right-wing dictator. It was thought that this was providing an opportunity for communists, and thus there was an assassination plot mounted against Trujillo as well. Meanwhile, defensively, the Eisenhower administration was, as you know, trying to help South Vietnam and providing it various kinds of aid, which enabled Diem to maintain himself. An advisory group in the Philippines had helped to put down the Huc Rebellion. We had reached a defense treaty with Taiwan, which was now part of the American sphere. And Dulles also pursued what was called Pactomania, signing up anybody he could for loose alliances against communist expansion. In Southeast Asia, we had CEDAW, including Thailand, including the Philippines, including Australia, New Zealand, a couple of European powers, and promising to defend South Vietnam, although South Vietnam couldn't join it. But this wasn't a formal ironclad alliance like NATO. In Central Asia, we had CENTO, or what was called the Baghdad Pact, including Turkey, originally Iraq, Iran, which was now an American client under the Shah, and Pakistan. Unfortunately, it had to be renamed after 1958, when, going back to 1960, when the Iraqi government was overthrown and ceased to be an American ally, although it took some time for it to be a Soviet client. Now, there's one other thing I have to mention about the Eisenhower administration, which relates to this issue of Pactomania and so on. As I say, they did not undertake any large-scale military action against communism because they didn't have to, but they planned to. They planned to in great detail, laying down policies saying that we would defend just about any territory in the world if it was threatened by communist aggression. And how would we defend it? Mainly with the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Eisenhower was a deficit hawk. He had cut the size of the army, and he liked the idea of relying on our technological edge. And this is why Kennedy, when he came into office, as I discovered writing a book on this, was confronted immediately with all sorts of proposals to intervene in South Vietnam and in Laos, based on the idea that if there was escalation by a communist power, North Vietnam or China, we would immediately resort to nuclear weapons. So even though those plans were not implemented, they were an important legacy. Okay, we turn now to the Kennedy administration, which pursued somewhat different policies. Kennedy, like his opponent Richard Nixon, was a shrewd politician. Now that the Republicans had been in power for 8 years and certain territories had gone communist, he wasn't going to pass up that opportunity either, and this captures the spirit of the 1960 campaign, although it is a question posed at a debate, not a statement by Kennedy himself. In other words, well, Mr. Nixon, in 1952, you blamed the Democrats for the loss of China. Should we now be blaming you for the loss of Cuba, which might not be as big as China, but it's a hell of a lot closer, and therefore a source of concern. And Kennedy took a hard line on a lot of Cold War issues, actually on the strategic nuclear front as well in the campaign. But he went in a different direction when he came in certain respects. And in particular, he began using diplomacy as an active weapon to try to draw certain nations from the leftist or neutralist camp into the American camp. Indeed, I think that in my lifetime, the most effective diplomats in the White House, and certainly the ones who spent the most time on diplomacy and enjoyed it the most, were Kennedy and Bush 1. Kennedy, first of all, wanted to show that he sympathized with the aspirations of the Third World. He remarked to his wife, as I have recently learned, that the most important ambassadors were now in the Third World, where the battleground was. And he immediately made it clear that neutralism, which Dulles had violently opposed, was now okay. And he cultivated not only neutralists like Nehru in India, but even the more leftist Sukarno in Indonesia. He also made a gesture towards Nkrumah in Ghana, a leftist who had actually been educated in the United States, and also toward the government of Guinea. Meanwhile, there was a leftist elected government in Brazil under Goulart, and Kennedy was trying to live with that government as well. Kennedy didn't live long enough for a lot of this to bear fruit, but it was a very serious matter, and for instance, he was going to visit Indonesia in 1964 if he had lived. However, he believed in sticks as well as carrots, and he continued covert action on some fronts. Kennedy carried out the Bay of Pigs invasion with some reservations, which of course turned out disastrously because Castro was well established and wasn't going to be toppled by 1,500 men. But he remained absolutely committed to overthrowing Castro through covert action. And in fact, that effort was continuing even right up to the eve of Kennedy's own death, even though it was supposed to be interrupted, according to some interpretations, after the missile crisis. It was not. The CIA also organized a successful covert campaign in British Guiana, of all places, which had elected a Marxist as its first leader. And the idea of another avowed Marxist in Latin America was enough to terrorize Washington, and he was removed. That one was kept off the front pages. I was about as well-informed a teenager as you could find in those days, partly because I was living overseas, but I had no idea about any of all that until many years later. Okay, and he was trying to live with Goulart in Brazil, as I mentioned. Okay, meanwhile, in the Congo, we continued our covert effort. Lumumba was already dead, but eventually we succeeded in getting General Mobutu into power, and he became a client of ours for several decades. So those were offensive strategies. What about defensive strategies under Kennedy? Well, help for friendly governments was pushed on a lot of fronts. One was the Alliance for Progress, an effort to promote both economic development and democracy all over Latin America, where Kennedy also traveled several times. And the United States helped many Latin American nations practice what I call preventive counterinsurgency. That is, strengthening their intel, their police forces, and so on, so that many possible insurgencies in various parts of Latin America never got big enough for us to hear about. This is very important For some years, I've been promulgating Kaiser's Law, which states that by the time you're reading about an insurgency on the front page of the New York Times, it's probably too late to think about eliminating it altogether. But many of the ones in South America never got nearly that far, and that is a characteristic of success. Okay. Now, meanwhile, with respect to Indochina, Kennedy, as I have said, was immediately confronted with a whole host of proposals from the bureaucracy in 1961 to intervene both in Laos and South Vietnam. And against the almost unanimous advice of his senior advisors, he would not do so. He received this piece of friendly advice from Charles de Gaulle on a trip to France in 1961. And it's a little long, but it's rather fascinating. Remember, the French, like the British, were old players in this imperial game. They had just fought 2 unsuccessful wars against insurgencies in Indochina and Algeria. So now de Gaulle is saying to Kennedy, rather prophetically, it's possible to maintain influence if you don't put in troops. And then he adds at the bottom that point that if you give a government in a third world country too much money, it becomes corrupt and it becomes unpopular. And I am sure that that insight will continue to resonate with some of you. So instead, as you know, the strategy in Vietnam focused on trying to bolster the Diem government, the existing regime. Kennedy refused to let Southeast Asia become a primary problem. The only time that it was in the crisis of the Diem regime in the months just before Kennedy's death. He was much more focused on Berlin, on Cuba, on the Congo, on various other parts of the third world. And when all these arguments in his administration came to a climax on the 15th of November in an NSC meeting, he gave, I think, a rather brilliant short exposition on why this would be a terrible place to fight. Now, I realize that you're not going to be able to read that from start to finish right now. You can look at it later. That quote is excerpted by Scholzinger on page 112, but I think you want to have the whole thing. What he is saying is the conflict in Vietnam is not clear because it's a guerrilla conflict. It's a long way away. We've given the government a lot of money, and they don't seem to be doing very much with it. Our allies in Europe won't give us any help on this, and it'll be awfully tough to explain to the American people. In other words, really a fine list of reasons why going in there wouldn't be a good idea. But the strategy of helping Diem wasn't working in 1963. Diem was clearly losing the support of the South Vietnamese people, or had lost it. He was also losing the war, although that was less clear to the American policymakers at that time. And thus, Kennedy was persuaded, in the end, to allow for another preventive coup, if you will, in the hope that a new government would be more effective. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. Now, there are a couple of more things I ought to mention before I leave Kennedy behind. One is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's go back to a map. Here, the United States, the whale in this great conflict, used classic Corbettian strategy to force the Soviets to remove the intermediate-range nuclear missiles that they had put in Cuba. We had the naval force to surround it, and the land force, which we were preparing to invade it and occupy it, and that, in the end, left Khrushchev essentially no choice but to agree to withdraw the missiles. We could also back all this with the threat of general war, since it was now clear to everybody in 1962 that we had enormous strategic superiority. This was a very close-run thing. We only have learned relatively recently how dangerous all this was. We were quite close to invading Cuba. We might have done so, and if we had, Guantanamo immediately would have been hit by a tactical nuclear weapon, a Soviet tactical nuclear weapon in Cuba, which was ready to go. In fact, the guy manning that weapon has been interviewed by an American scholar. We did not know about those tactical nuclear weapons, and we didn't know how close we had come. But as it was, Khrushchev, acknowledging our Corbettian superiority, did pull out and that was certainly a great triumph for American strategy that you would be well advised to look into more carefully. Lastly, I must mention a rather scary footnote to this whole issue of covert action and CIA assassination plots. I mentioned that under Eisenhower, the CIA had enlisted several mafia chieftains to assassinate Fidel Castro, which they had not been able to do. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General under JFK, immediately mounted the biggest attack by far that had ever been mounted on American organized crime, an attack that extended to the same mob chieftains that had been hired to assassinate Castro. When Robert Kennedy found out that they had been hired to assassinate Castro, he was furious. He told the CIA to turn this off. The CIA told them that they had, but, and this was the subject of my last book that I spent most of the last decade researching, the CIA did not turn it off, but they allowed it to continue. And I concluded in that book that feeling double-crossed and under great pressure, those mob chieftains then decided to arrange the assassination of President Kennedy, which in fact they did, even though there's no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald had pulled the trigger. Now there is a broader point here, and it's a point about covert action. When you embark on covert action, you are creating a zone of illegality. You are promoting illegality. It's the same thing that you are doing when, for instance, you outlaw certain drugs or prostitution, which people are bound to engage in, but you are turning it into an illegal zone where normal laws will not apply. And when you create a zone of illegality through covert action as well, anything can happen, including things that you obviously did not intend. So that is a policy consideration that needs to be weighed. A lot of the strategies that we undertook in the Third World undermined the domestic laws of other countries, our own domestic law, and international law. So we turn now to the Johnson administration and what is the climax of our story from the standpoint of this week and the war in Vietnam. Now, Kennedy and Nixon and Eisenhower, too, I would say, were probably all more interested in foreign policy than in domestic affairs. Johnson was the opposite. He was fascinated by domestic affairs, by the dream of completing the work of the New Deal and ending poverty in America. And he was, frankly, very uncomfortable in foreign affairs and dealing with foreign leaders. It is rather fascinating that Johnson, who in the domestic arena always understood that in dealing with a politician, you had to understand his concerns, could not get that through his head in dealing with foreign leaders, whose job, he seemed to think, was to support the United States. In any case, partly because Johnson was mainly a domestic president, one could speculate, he had very conventional Cold War views about foreign policy, and he was determined that no territory was going to be lost to communism on his watch. And he was going to use all defensive strategies available, including military ones, to stop that. And this was not only in Southeast Asia. There was a political crisis in the Dominican Republic in the spring of 1965. Johnson sent in the Marines and the 82nd Airborne, something which even at the time looked like a fantastic overreaction to a lot of people. Art Buchwald, the columnist, wrote that our Marines and Army asked the communists to surrender, but they couldn't find any communists, which was not that far from the truth. In the end, this was settled politically, but it was very unpopular in Latin America. Okay, so why Vietnam? Well, to begin with, there are those good old traditional Athenian feelings of fear, honor, and interest, all of which I would suggest are very clearly in evidence in this, one of Johnson's basic speeches on Vietnam in the spring of 1965 on the eve of the war. More specifically, one would have to say that Johnson was turning to military action because all our other defensive strategies had failed. We had not been able to come up with a non-communist government that could compete with the North Vietnamese and with the NLF in South Vietnam. Now again, there's nothing inevitable about that. You're going to read some very good material on the NLF and the North Vietnamese, and they were a highly organized, very clever movement, and probably the most determined enemy we ever faced in the Third World. It simply happened that in this case, there was nothing comparable on our side. We had given up on Diem, and it turned out, actually, that Diem's immediate successors for the next 18 months, this was a dirty secret, didn't want to fight the war. They preferred to make some kind of a deal with the NLF and some sort of coalition government, and in fact, several of them were removed, again, with our assistance or support for that very reason. So instead, Johnson and his advisors, as you will read in detail, decided that American military power, including air power, could solve the problem. Now, there is another terribly ironic reason, I think, for the decision to go in, which is very simply that there has seldom been a moment in American history when everything seemed to be going so well as in the spring of 1965, both on the foreign and the domestic fronts. Europe and Berlin were now quiet. Kennedy had concluded the test ban treaty, a big step toward détente. Khrushchev, who had been a very scary figure, was gone and had been replaced by much more cautious leadership in the Soviet Union and by Soviet leadership that was eager for better relations with the United States. Cuba was now on the back burner. On the other hand, China was viewed as more dangerous than ever. We now knew there was a Sino-Soviet split. We knew that Mao was backing Ho Chi Minh, as indeed he was. And the thinking in Washington among Johnson's senior advisors, and Johnson himself, I think, was, okay, the Soviets have learned their lesson over Berlin, over the Cuban Missile Crisis, that they can't directly challenge the United States. But China has not. And they have to be taught a similar lesson, and we're going to have to do that in South Vietnam, or they will create nothing but trouble for a long time. So in we went. Meanwhile, at home, there was a consensus in the United States on domestic issues that really was extremely unusual. After Kennedy's death, the whole country had pulled behind Johnson. The Civil Rights Acts had been passed. Medicare had been passed, other Great Society legislation. The country was booming. We had practically no deficit. We had a very strong dollar. In short, one might suggest we felt that we could do anything. And as Thucydides says at one point about the Athenians, we were in the mood of feeling that we could get whatever we wanted by wishing for it. So off we went. Now, this lecture isn't about the fighting in Vietnam. You will get a lot of reading about that, and you will get more about that in other lectures. But I have this one slide simply to bring home a couple of basic facts. First of all, it seems to me that people of your generation can't be reminded too often what a gigantic effort this was, dwarfing anything that you have been involved in. Not only did we get to 500,000 men in country, and not only did we have 500,000 men in country for about 3 years, but, meaning no disrespect whatever or slighting of the sacrifices that soldiers have made over the last 10 years, we still are nowhere near one maximum year, 1968, in South Vietnam in terms of the number of killed in action. You can also follow the story of the air war on this map, on this graph. And I do want to make one point about that occurred to me getting ready with this. The decision to bomb North Vietnam allowed the Soviet Union and China to intervene very substantially in this war and very effectively at relatively low cost to them by providing air defense, which they did. And that was one of the things under the ground rules of the Cold War that you were always allowed to do without being drawn into the war yourself. The Soviets sent SAMs. The Chinese also sent large numbers of men and equipment for anti-aircraft defenses. And as you can see, it was extremely effective. And none of this would have happened had the decision to bomb North Vietnam not been made. Now, the irony of Johnson getting into this war, which destroyed all his dreams, was that had he not gone into it, even by 1966, looking at our next map, he would have been able to point to plenty of good news. Thanks again, in significant measure, to the CIA. Thanks to another covert action early in 1964, the leftist regime in Brazil was gone, replaced by military government. Now, I have very mixed feelings about this, as I'll say later. In fact, this helped start a trend toward military government in Latin America that lasted well into the 80s. But in any event, a regime which was regarded as shaky and which certainly was playing footsie with communists was gone. And in Indonesia, where Sukarno was ruling with the help of a large communist party, that situation had changed completely too in the fall of 1965, when apparently the communists tried to seize power, the army generals outmaneuvered them, and then over the next few years, the army, with some CIA people sitting in on this apparently, carried out an absolutely massive purge of the Indonesian Communist Party. So two of the biggest, most strategically significant third world nations suddenly had become American clients instead of leftist regimes. Meanwhile, obviously, JFK's diplomatic approach to these kinds of third world regimes was very much on the back burner, and that wasn't going to return for some time. The medium-term consequences of Vietnam are handled very well by Schlesinger. I think the strongest part of Schlesinger's book, by the way, is the handling of the domestic consequences and of the way that the Vietnam War changed the United States. And I definitely can commend that part to you. There were long-term consequences of a huge nature for American foreign policy and for the American military. The Army in particular, of course, adopted the principle of no more Vietnams and was able to stick to that principle for a very long time. The war created a new violent controversy over the proper American war in the world, American role in the world, which of course is continuing even now, and it changed American values in all sorts of ways that are continuing even now. But that's a subject for another time. Meanwhile, Johnson and the Democrats were voted out in 1968, and Nixon came in. And Nixon introduced some very interesting new aspects to this whole story. Nixon's attitude towards Southeast Asia had something in common with his great rival, Kennedy's, in that he wanted to turn it into more of a back burner issue. He had bigger fish to fry. He wanted to improve relations not only with the Soviet Union, but with China. And it's clear that he had thought that out even before he got into office. And after a year and a half of heavy fighting, and I stress that fighting in Vietnam continued at a high level for a year and a half under Nixon, he realized that he simply had to de-escalate, and he began to do so. He stuck to our formal goal of an independent, non-communist South Vietnam almost to the end, when he did compromise with the NLF very significantly. But meanwhile, he was gradually allowing our objectives to be dictated by vastly reduced capabilities. And Nixon now, meanwhile, was making up for whatever might happen in Vietnam with some spectacular diplomatic successes, not only with the Soviet Union, but in the Third World. And these are shown actually in the Ford administration. Hang on a second. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. In the covering the Ford administration. First of all, China, okay, Indochina by this time is gone. But China is now clearly not only independent from the Soviet Union, but it's in an informal alliance with the United States against the Soviet Union. A huge change. It is ironic, of course, that it was Nixon who brought about this change, since he had made his career complaining about the loss of China to communism in 1952. But that doesn't prevent me, certainly, from giving him credit for making this change. And China in 1972 had not changed internally at all. In fact, the Cultural Revolution was still going on. But Nixon and Kissinger still realized that this was a great strategic opportunity, and they took it. Almost equally significant developments occurred in Egypt, which had been a Soviet client since 1956, and the main enemy of Israel, which had definitely emerged as an American ally after 1967. In 1972, Anwar Sadat, through the Soviet advisors out of Egypt, one big advantage that we had in the Third World conflict was that the Soviets were extremely clumsy imperialists, worse than us at our worst, and they wore out their welcome very quickly in a number of countries, and that was one. Sadat then attacked Israel. He got a ceasefire, and Nixon and Kissinger again saw a great opportunity, and they moved in to arrange not only a ceasefire but disengagement and to turn Egypt into an American client instead of a Soviet one. This was a revolutionary change. Going back to my Thucydides analogy, I would compare it to what Brasidas did in Thrace when, as you remember, he marched through parts of the Athenian Empire simply promising them a better deal and promising not to interfere in their internal affairs, and they came over to him in droves. So these were revolutionary changes brought about completely by diplomacy, and a very interesting lesson indeed about what could be accomplished. But closer to home, Nixon played offense and relied on the CIA. We step back to 1971 here to point out the Marxist government of Salvador Allende that had been elected in 1970 in Chile, a country with a long democratic tradition. Nixon, again, regarded this as Castro squared, and he told Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, between the election and the inauguration, that man is not going to take power, and you see to it. And Helms and the CIA tried to mount a coup to prevent Allende from taking power in 1970, but it failed, and he did take power. Now, Allende was not a communist, although he was a Marxist. He was not a totalitarian. He did nationalize a good many enterprises, including American ones, and we quickly imposed economic sanctions on him. What we didn't know until relatively recently is that the CIA never gave up on its efforts to overthrow him, and indeed were deeply involved in the coup that did overthrow him in 1971. Again, military rule in Chile lasted for the better part of 2 decades, whereupon it was finally overthrown and repudiated by the Chilean people. So, going back to 1971, Chile is back in our camp. Indochina is gone. Cambodia at this point is a Chinese ally, not a Soviet one. There's another new development. Portugal had a coup d'etat and became a democracy in 1974-5 and gave up its empire in Africa. And these territories, Angola and Mozambique, immediately became the scene of civil wars between different factions, all of them in Angola Marxist, but some of them patronized by the Soviets, some by the Chinese, some by us. Now, interesting footnote to this, this was also the era of Watergate, of course, and Watergate led to a lot of revelations about CIA covert activity abroad and at home. This is when we learned about many of the things I've talked about today. And there were House and Senate investigations of what the CIA had done under Ford. There was new legislation passed. There was an attempt to restrict covert action and make it accountable. And that stopped Ford and Kissinger from getting into the Angola situation. There was a further complicating factor in Angola because the pro-Soviets were also assisted by Cubans, Cuban troops. This was Castro's dream, to come across as the Messiah for the whole Third World, and he was able to do it. But the Congress actually stopped Gerald Ford from getting involved in that one at that time. Okay, I now turn to Carter and Reagan. It looks like this may be about 5 minutes over, but I don't think it will be more than that. I'm lumping Carter and Reagan together because I don't have a whole lot to say about Carter. In Egypt, he built on what Nixon and Ford had done and actually arranged the peace between Egypt and Israel. He had human rights views that were somewhat reminiscent of Kennedy, perhaps. And indeed, in the late 70s, he allowed a leftist regime to overthrow a long-standing American client, the Somoza family in Nicaragua. And that leftist regime was the Sandinistas. Again, I'm not saying that we could necessarily have stopped it, but at any rate, he decided this was the Nicaraguan people's balance, and he stood aside. Meanwhile, all sorts of other things were happening in various parts of the world. Angola and Mozambique now seem to be firmly in the Soviet camp. So was Ethiopia, with Somalia on our side. And I think those are the major changes to report. Oh yes, North Vietnam had also invaded Cambodia and taken out the pro-Chinese Khmer Rouge and installed their own regime there. And this, and in Afghanistan, oh, okay, I'm sorry, another huge development, a new color on the map in Iran, where a militant anti-American Islamic regime had overthrown the Shah, our longstanding client, and really the keystone of our policy in that whole region, in 1979. Also in 1979, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. Carter had begun the covert war there, and that was a zone of conflict. And this was the situation when Ronald Reagan came on the scene. And he revived a lot of 50s rhetoric about the Soviet Union in particular and about communism in general. And here, for instance, he talks about the Soviets being on the march in Ethiopia, in South Yemen, in Angola, in Mozambique, etc. Now, at this point, I think it's not a bad idea to take a deep breath and step back and maybe look at our map again and think about this in terms of the monopoly board, okay? I don't mean any disrespect to the needs and aspirations of the peoples of Angola, Mozambique, South Yemen, or Ethiopia, and I wish them success in seeking life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if we think of this as the monopoly board, I think we would have to agree that by the 1980s here, Park Place and Boardwalk were bought up a long time ago. And the properties that are up for grabs are more along the lines of the electric company and Mediterranean and Baltic and things like that, in terms of their per capita income, resources, and strategic significance. However, that did not prevent an old Cold Warrior like Ronald Reagan not only from summoning the old enthusiasm, but from trying to implement it in many ways. Okay. On the defensive front, Reagan increased the counterinsurgency effort in El Salvador. And you will be reading something about that. It's a very interesting story. Now again, Congress and the military were still very Vietnam shy. And some of you have heard all about this from Professor Weigelstein, who was the head of the advisory effort in El Salvador. Our presence was limited to 55 advisors in El Salvador. And they managed to help the El Salvadorian government fight this to a stalemate. Meanwhile, so that was a defensive operation. But meanwhile, Reagan was going on the offense with what became known as the Reagan Doctrine, although he never enunciated it, the support of anti-Soviet, really would be more accurate, guerrilla movements in other parts of the world, fighting against pro-Soviet regimes. That applied to Nicaragua, where he stood up the Contras, who did not score any notable military successes. That applied to Angola and Mozambique, where we took sides in those civil wars. And of course, it applied to Afghanistan. Indeed, by 1988 here, the Soviets are out of Afghanistan, although in 1988, don't forget, the pro-Soviet government was still in power. It did not fall for several years after that, or at least still in power in Kabul. I would have to say, all right, the Cold War was ending by the time Reagan went out of office. Next week, you'll have plenty of time to go into that, to discuss the relative roles of Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, and to argue about exactly why the Soviet Union collapsed. I personally would find it very difficult to argue that these initiatives of Reagan in the Third World, with the possible exception of Afghanistan, were a critical element in that process. But I'll leave you to think about that. Now, so the Cold War was coming to an end, and let me, with a footnote, talk a little bit about some very interesting developments under the first President Bush. The fall of communism and the termination of the Cold War enabled us to look at a lot of these conflicts in a different light, for instance, in Central America. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas had held an election in 1984 under Reagan, and we had apparently passed the word to our allies in Nicaragua to take no part in the election because we didn't want to give the Sandinistas the legitimacy of winning what seemed to be a contested election. There was another election in 1990, and this time we gave opposite advice, and the Sandinistas were voted out democratically. And the Contra movement thus could be wrapped up. And since then, the Sandinistas have been out of power, in power, out of power, all through elections. And in El Salvador, and really a remarkable achievement, the Civil War was settled by a compromise under which the guerrillas became part of the Salvadorian army. And their political arm also began to compete politically. That settlement is, the possibility of that settlement is referred to in the reading you have, which covers, which was written before the war was over. And it did take place. And in El Salvador, too, since then, the two sides have competed with victories on both sides at the political level in elections. So all of this turned out to be much easier to deal with when we didn't have to view it in the perspective of this global conflict. I would like to say a few words comparing the end of the Cold War to the end of the Peloponnesian War. The turning point in the Peloponnesian War, it's fair to say, was, of course, the Sicilian expedition, the Athenians' Vietnam, if you will. And the collapse of that expedition changed the nature of the Peloponnesian War. If you recall, there were revolts all over the Athenian Empire, and from then on, even though the war still had about a decade to run, the Athenians were playing defense, fighting in their own territory, and also risking their whole existence in naval encounters with enemy fleets. But nothing like that happened in the United States after the collapse of Vietnam, because it was a very peripheral area, and in the end, the Cold War was decided, I would argue, in that first front. In the Western alliance that kept the capitalist, democratic world, industrial world under one umbrella for so long, following the wisdom of Kennan, and in Eastern Europe, where communism never really took root. Kennan argued in another writing in the late 40s that in the end, the Soviet Union was going to be doomed because it was based on false principles and a false view of human nature. And it took a long time, but I think he was right. And thus, these turned out to be peripheral conflicts, in my opinion, that were not going to have a decisive effect. In conclusion, in large measure, the basis for all these interventions, coups, diplomatic shifts, and wars was the domino theory. But I think we can safely conclude now that the domino theory was way exaggerated and, in fact, was false. Let's face it, we eventually ran the experiment. We did lose South Vietnam. It had regional consequences. The rest of Indochina, Cambodia and Laos, two small countries, went communist as well. It did not go beyond that. Ironically, at no time did our major allies, including the Japanese and the Western Europeans, feel that the fate of South Vietnam was critical to what was going to happen to them. And they had quite a different feeling about Korea. Maybe we should have listened more to them. In short, it was not necessary to win them all. It was merely necessary to win some and lose some. And if you review these maps, you will see that that's what we did in just about every one of these decades. And that, as it turned out, was enough. Lastly, let's return to the menu of strategies, to which I have assigned my own very personal grades, which you are not to treat as wholly read. And I admit these are matters of taste. Assistance for state building seems to me worked pretty well under defense. Preventive regime change worked very poorly, most notably in Vietnam. Full-scale war or military occupation, oh yes, I'm sorry, I didn't give Reagan credit. Reagan also carried out the one military rollback success of the Cold War, the invasion of Grenada. Of course, I couldn't put that on the map because you wouldn't have been able to see it. But that was military action to win back territory from a leftist regime. Full-scale war led to a draw in Korea for reasons that you're familiar with. It was a disaster in Vietnam. I think, if anything, that was a little generous. Now, what about the offensive strategies? Now, the CIA-sponsored coups, you're going to have to make up your own mind. It is true that in the short and medium term, they seemed to bring about some major successes for the US in places like Brazil and Iran and Guatemala and various others. But the long-term consequences of them were extremely iffy. It is no accident that the first major Islamic regime in Iran overthrew a government that had been put in place and maintained in place by the United States. That was what we call blowback. And in many of these other cases, too, the long-term consequences were very iffy. In addition, there's the moral aspect of overthrowing a foreign government and the legal aspect, which I think is a policy question as well as a moral question. That is, does it really pay for a status quo power like the United States that claims to be promoting a world based on law to do this kind of thing? My skepticism, I'm sure, is very clear to all of you. To diplomatic breakthroughs, I'm going to give an A. Again, without firing a single shot or even deploying many troops, Nixon transformed the world balance of power in China and the regional balance of power in Egypt. And there were other opportunities for things like that, too. Very cost effective. For support for an insurgency, all I can give is a C. Did have a good effect in Afghanistan. In Angola and Mozambique, these wars killed large numbers of people, devastated the country, and really, I don't think any reasonable person could tell the difference between the two contenders. And I'm very sad the United States ever thought that we had to get mixed up in anything like that. Full-scale war, I already mentioned offensively, Grenada. That's about the only one. Of course, we tried it in North Korea, where it didn't work either. Now, lastly, the strategy of political and economic isolation, which we are still pursuing, of course, against Cuba. Now, one of my colleagues has suggested to me that I'm being too harsh because embargoes on enemy states can work to the advantage of friendly states. And there may be some truth to that. But as a weapon to bring down an unfriendly government, I think it's a complete failure, and I wish we would give it up. Now, once again, today, much of the world is threatened by an ideology, militant Islam, which is often hostile to the values and interests of the United States. And our response to that has been our major preoccupation for the last decade and will continue to be so for some time. Now, militant Islam, in my opinion, is not nearly as well organized as communist parties were, nor does it threaten such critical areas of the world. Remember, in 1946, there was a lot of worry about communism in Western Europe, too. Meanwhile, world population is way up, and the size of our military is way down compared to the Cold War. So I hope that this lecture has not only put Vietnam in context, but will get you thinking about what our various responses are, including diplomacy, to this new crisis, what the limits of our ability to effect political change in the Islamic world are, about the degree of freedom that we owe the other peoples of the world to determine their destiny, and above all, over whether we can or must win them all. Thank you. Although I have run a little over, I do want to encourage you to ask me any questions, not only about this, but if there's something about Vietnam that I have not covered, I'll be glad to take a crack at that. So, question time. Oh, AV, don't take the slide down. Could somebody go back to them and get that message through? Oh, good. Okay. Questions? Yes.
Tom Kelly from National Geospatial Intelligence Agency.
Yep.
I look forward to a seminar next week with you, Professor, and share our thoughts on President Reagan's impact on the fall of the Soviet Union.
Sure.
My question deals with India. Throughout the length and the breadth of the Cold War, all the maps you showed up there, it had India as neutral.
Yes.
As nominally as part of the non-aligned movement.
Yes.
India was pretty much an independent country. However, they did have a large amount of Soviet military equipment. They operated with the Soviet Navy in the Indian Ocean during the 80s. So why would you have them as neutral and not as a Soviet?
I thought about that, and India could have been colored like Egypt as a Soviet client, and maybe should have, but I only had time to open so many cans of worms, and that was one I just stayed away. But I think you have a perfectly legitimate point there. Yes. Actually, since you mentioned that, it's one of the tragedies of Vietnam I discovered. In the early 60s, India and Pakistan, which of course was also Bangladesh then, were having problems, and we were trying to mediate. And in the spring of 65, when we started bombing North Vietnam, the leaders of India, Shastri, and Pakistan, I think that was Ayub Khan, were both scheduled to come to the US and visit Johnson at the White House. And then we started bombing North Vietnam, and both of them attacked the bombing of North Vietnam. And Johnson canceled those visits, both of them. And later in 1965, war broke out between Pakistan and India, and actually then the Soviets stepped in to mediate that war, and that was the beginning of the Soviet-Indian relationship. So that was part of the opportunity cost of Vietnam. But the basic answer to your question, Tom, is yes, you're right. Yep.
Colonel Spiegel, Seminar 7. Really great presentation about looking at these conflicts in the big picture over a large period of time, and it got me to thinking, it's often said that in Vietnam, the U.S. won every engagement but lost the battle. Looking at it from a perspective of Vietnam today, could you make an argument that we did not lose the battle, or did not lose the war?
Well, I don't agree with the argument that we won any engagement. The vast majority of engagements in Vietnam were small unit engagements, which could reasonably be described as stalemates. In big battles, we inflicted much heavier casualties, yes, but that's for another time. However, yes, you are absolutely right, and in fact, what is really extraordinary is that people who spend time in Asia, which I have not, will tell you that the US is now far more popular in Vietnam than it is in South Korea. And my son has been to Vietnam, and I know other young people who have been to Vietnam, and to Vietnamese today, particularly young Vietnamese, this is like the Civil War for us. Well, actually, it's probably further away than the Civil War for us, but that's not the story. And in fact, I got a question in the ILC from the Vietnamese officer when I lectured on Vietnam. And the first thing he said was, "I want you to know I'm so sick of hearing about this war." So yeah, I mean, well, obviously it's easier to be a generous winner, as the Vietnamese are really towards us, than to be in continued dependence like the South Koreans are. Yeah. Yes.
Good morning, sir. Captain Will Steps, U.S. Navy. I was struck in reading Schultzinger's Chapter 1 about how close we were to having a great friend in Vietnam in 1946, and what an enormous opportunity we missed to bring Ho Chi Minh into the family by embracing the Declaration of Independence, as it were, and helping them cast off French colonialism. It was almost, you know, it was almost tragic. Then you read Undersecretary Ball's report from 1964, counterfactual. If Undersecretary Ball had been the president rather than Lyndon Johnson, was there another opportunity perhaps to switch allegiance right there and to turn a potential awful situation of declining situation into a friend, and perhaps be, you know, basically flip a communist by turning him into a nationalist ally?
Well, to begin with, and this is the point of my book, American Tragedy, you don't need to go to the limit of the counterfactual of George Ball being president. You could just take the easier counterfactual of John Kennedy remaining president. And I disagree with Schultzinger about that. My book came out a few years after his. I'm not sure I would have changed his mind, though, but anyway. All we had to do, you see, the NLF and the North Vietnamese were not fighting officially for a unified Vietnam. That certainly was their goal, but they were fighting for an American withdrawal and a coalition government in South Vietnam. And there were many South Vietnamese who wanted that too in early 1965. And all we needed to do was agree to that. And that's roughly what Kennedy had done in Laos. You see, the thing that's caused so much confusion is that Kennedy died without knowing how bad the situation was in South Vietnam. And he only faced problems as they arose. And that problem hadn't arisen yet, as far as he knew. But yes, we certainly couldn't have done that. And in fact, the thing that made me shiver doing the research for my book was reading the press. You see, Johnson, he basically decided on the war in early December '64, in principle. But then he wanted to delay the beginning as long as possible to get as much legislation through Congress as he could before it happened. And so there's a period in January, February, where it looks as if we're really going to let it go. And in terms of the public reaction, it just looks like one huge sigh of relief. And then suddenly we start bombing and the Marines land in Da Nang. So yes, I don't think there's any question but that option was open. And as I say, we were scoring points in other parts of the world, and even in Southeast Asia. Of course, the Indonesian thing, to be fair, we started the war in the spring of '65. The military coup in Indonesia, the fall of Sukarno, was 6 months later. So we didn't know that was going to happen. But yeah, I think that opportunity was definitely open, but it wasn't the consensus position. No more questions. Well, hang on. Are there any more questions? I don't see anybody. All right. As many of you know, this is my final lecture as a full-time S&P faculty member after 22 years. And I'm going to allow myself a final word about the enterprise in which we are engaged in. And since I am never shy about admitting that somebody else said something better than I could have ever said it, I'm going to return once again to the master. And I'll give you a minute to read that. Okay. I have been a part of the American military in a non-combatant role for 6 years in the 1970s and now for the last 22 years. And what is your role in the world? Well, I would suggest that ultimately we have militaries and we maintain militaries for the same kind of reason that we have lawyers and doctors. That is, to deal with problems, which hopefully are occasional problems, that get in the way of our living a normal life. When we are sick, we need a doctor. When we need to draw up a binding contract or settle a dispute, we need a lawyer. Sometimes nations need to fight a war, and then we need you. But no one can live endlessly sick, endlessly in legal conflict, or endlessly at war. It is the premise of civilization that the normal state is peace. Now, it is difficult to apply this quote to the conflicts I've been talking about in the Third World, because these were not cases involving great and decisive actions. They were, by their nature, indecisive, and that makes life more difficult. And the same is true of the conflicts in which we are involved today. But that does not change our basic problem. We need to embed military action in a series of events, a chain of events leading, within a reasonably short period at least, to peace. And this is going to require, I think, in dealing with our current predicament, a superior level of strategic calculation, perhaps, than we have been able to show so far. Vietnam had another highly significant event, as I already mentioned. It started the strategy and policy course 40 years ago under Stansfield Turner. And it's been a great privilege for me to try to contribute to the development of more effective strategic thinking over 2 decades. And now we face problems that need answers and new answers. The United States and the world need peace. And if we cannot find a way to greater peace, we will be letting down our countrymen. We will be letting down the world, which inevitably depends on the wisdom of the world's strongest power, the United States. And last, but hardly least, we will be letting down you and the men and women who serve under you and all your families. So, as you go off into the world to turn your attention to problems from the tactical level on up, I wish you the best of luck in that great, quintessentially American task, so movingly defined in my youth by presidents like Kennedy and Johnson, and yes, even Nixon, of making the world a better and a safer place in which to live. Thank you very much.